Welcome back. Now, although South Africa's education system has made great strides over the past 30 years of our democracy, the Department of Basic Education is still facing huge challenges. The lack of basic school infrastructure, including proper sanitation and overcrowded classrooms at many of our schools, are some of the difficult conditions still hindering achievement of equal education for all. Now, presenting the 2023 National Senior Certificate Examination results last week, Minister of Basic Education Angie Motshekga said that access to educational institutions has expanded steadily. And not only do more young people attend and complete schooling than ever before, but access to early learning opportunities has also expanded dramatically. So to talk to us more about the state of the country's basic education system, we're joined virtually by Professor Sarita Ramsaroop, who's head of Department of Childhood Education at the University of Johannesburg, and Kimberley Khumalo, who's researcher at Equal Education, an organization advocating for quality and equality education. Professor Ramsaroop and Kimberley, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live to both of you. So let me just start with the question about, quality. 30 years of South Africa's democracy. Is our country on track as far as the sustainable development goals of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality of education for all? Professor, let me start with you.
Sakina, could you kindly, good morning to you, Sakina, and to your listeners as well. Could you kindly repeat the question? My internet connectivity somehow was disrupted.
No problem. I was asking about whether we as a country are on track to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education for all our children.
Sakina, we've made tremendous strides, as you've alluded to earlier, but we've still got a lot of work to be done in the areas, for example, of infrastructure in schools, to ensure that all children are exposed to the similar quality of resources across the country. We've got many challenges, ranging from, especially in the township areas, the rural areas, that still reflect pre-1994 situations in schools. And they range from overcrowding to lack of resources and infrastructure issues across the different provinces, with some provinces doing a lot better as compared to the others.
Kimberley, as far as equal education is concerned, you, I imagine, would have tracked at least some of these metrics along the 30-year journey that we've had as a democracy. So how are we faring?
So at Equal Education, like you're saying, we've tracked a lot of these metrics, and what we're seeing is, particularly with school infrastructure, the issues are still quite daunting. So in urban provinces such as the Western Cape and Gauteng, the issue of overcrowding is becoming worse and worse. We know from recent statistics that about 8,000 schools are in need of additional classrooms. And about 13,000 schools, particularly in the rural provinces such as the Eastern Cape, KZN, and Limpopo, are in need of 13,000 more toilets. So there is a huge infrastructure backlog, and items such as having libraries and laboratories in schools are still being highly neglected, even though there was a norms and standards deadline for 2023 for those things to be allocated to schools. So the infrastructure issue in schools, both rural and province and urban, is quite terrible at this moment. Although there are great strides towards having good school infrastructure, there's still a very long way to go, and we need more political will and the urgency to deal with those issues.
Professor Ramsaroop, why is this the case, considering that South Africa actually does spend a considerable amount of GDP, more than many other countries the world over, on education? Why are we struggling?
I think it comes down to national treasury, the funding allocation. While we could be increasing the funding, I know that last year in the previous years, funding was allocated to improve infrastructure in schools. We find that money at province level is not being spent, and that has a knock-on effect simply because the following year, the amount that is allocated will then be reduced, and that, of course, compromises the ability of that province to meet the gaps in infrastructure requirements. We also have specifically provinces like the Western Cape and Gauteng. You've got rural-urban migration. You've also got an influx of people coming in from the rest of Africa to these two specific countries because of looking for jobs, and that, of course, has an impact on overcrowding. It becomes difficult to be able to also pin down the numbers of children that will be coming into schools, and that has a knock-on effect on overcrowding, resources, etc. in that particular school. We still have a lot of historical issues that we've inherited in many of the rural schools, in the township schools, that has also not been addressed. We've got, in addition to the pit toilet system, although there was a deadline on when that should be addressed, it still hasn't been. And it seems that government moves to action when a child loses one's life in these very unsafe conditions. We look at water, sanitation, electricity supply. These are social ills that plague the country. It's not just unique to a particular school or a province. We know what is going on with water shortages, and that's going to be the knock-on effect of climate change, etc. But also schools that don't have access to clean water. And these are things that each province needs to work very closely with your national treasury, and to be able to see how to enact and how to put in action measures to be able to address this. I think it's also very important. So while we leave it to the department, the different departments in the province, the school managers in a specific school should also be creative in looking at how to raise funds. Because when infrastructure is being placed or is being upgraded in specific schools, you normally find that, with protest action or just vandalism, the schools are back to where it started off. And that, of course, has an impact on sustainability in a community. So in addition to school managers being creative, being entrepreneurial in fundraising, I think it's also up to our communities as well to serve as guardians, to also prevent this. So it's everyone coming to the table to be able to address these issues, Sakina.
Kimberley, I'd like your view on this as well, but also I want to bring in the question of, quality education apart from the infrastructure challenges in schools, because you spoke about additional classrooms, whether it be prefab or whether they actually get to build these brick and mortar additional facilities in certain schools. Yes, there's the urban-rural dynamic, but even within the urban areas, you have situations whereby there are areas in townships usually where schools are empty, abandoned even, and juxtaposed to that, you have schools where parents all want to send their children to that simply cannot cater for the number of children. So the department, I would imagine, and then I had a conversation with the spokesperson last week, they say that this issue of quality is a perception. So let's address that. Are parents just being unfair in wanting to send their children to certain schools, whereas there are schools perhaps closer to home where these children could go and are not going to?
I think the point of parents being essentially stripped of the choice of where their children should go to is a bit, it's apartheid-centric, right? It's thinking in apartheid spatial planning ways. So we know that township schools and some rural schools are very under-resourced, and parents are looking for the best way to get some form of upward mobility, especially in an economy like ours. So it would make sense, perfect sense, to tell parents to pressure parents to put their children in township schools or rural schools if these schools were adequately resourced. We even heard from the DDG speech last week during the Motshekga announcement that the department is really struggling with quality. And that's one of the aspects that they haven't quite met. And we know that providing resources to these schools would make them really be able to provide some form of quality education, having enough teachers, for example, having enough classrooms, having all of the infrastructure that we've spoken about so far today. So it's really unfair to then say to parents that are aware of how our township schools are, how under-resourced, how much pressure they have to take in more and more learners, even with an admissions crisis, whereas former Model C schools don't have the same amount of pressure to take in more learners than they can afford to cater to, is a really unfair statement to make. If these schools were provided with adequate resources and were supported adequately by government in terms of some of the safety measures, for example, that former Model C schools have having things like psychosocial support, providing all of the amenities that make a school, then it would be a fair statement to make that learners should really choose township schools or see township schools and rural schools as an option. So right now, parents are really pressured to have a school for their learners that can give them some form of economic, social mobility. So it's unfair to ask them to do that when you aren't providing these schools with adequate resources and there isn't a real plan, a proactive plan to ensure that going forward, learners can be placed in more schools than you are currently providing.
Professor Ramsaroop, all of this, of course, against the backdrop that Minister Motshekga last week highlighted in her speech. When presenting those matric results, she stated that when the class of 2023 enrolled for grade 1 in 2012, there were 1.2 million learners, and the DBE database showed that 740,566 of those progressed from grade 1 in 2012 to grade 12 in 2023. So what may have happened to those missing learners? And I asked that question, but I'm a bit loath to ask it because we seem to make the point, ask the question every year. Is there any sort of, empirical work being done to actually tell us what is happening?
Sakina, there's many causes with why children drop out. It starts, of course, we spoke about infrastructure because it's very demotivating for children to be attending schools in that particular environment, which is not conducive to teaching and learning. We also have, if you have to look at inconsistent learner transport, we know, the research tells us, especially in the outlying rural areas, children leaving home at 4 o'clock, getting home very late at night poses huge safety risks in our country. The lack of resources, which we also spoke and alluded to earlier on. We have high pregnancy rates amongst our girls as well, that many of our girls don't return to school. We have barriers to learning, and these would include the language of teaching and learning in a particular school. So, for example, if a child's language of teaching and learning is sometimes the third, fourth, or it could be a foreign language as well, that child is completely excluded in that particular classroom and would feel very, very alienated, would not be able to, and of course is going to be left behind with the academic studies. You also have socioeconomic ills that also impact on the dropout rates that these students have been exposed to. You've got physical, emotional, sexual abuse that some of these children would have been exposed to as well, that would also impact on them. Their psychological well-being that hasn't really been addressed well, and most importantly, it's parental involvement. Do our parents, are they present in our children's lives? Are they, and even if they are they, how do they motivate their children to keep to being in these particular schools? I think, you make a very important point of what the data tells us, but also where to from here? How do we prevent? So it's good to celebrate the pass rates, but also we need to be very critical about why approximately 55% of these children that started grade 1 only reached grade 12. And how do we ensure that there are more children that actually complete or reach grade 12. It impacts negatively, not only on the country and the whole, but also on the individual child and on their opportunities in life. Yes, learner tracking is very, very important. And I don't think that is an area that we are doing very well in. It is something that from the department level as well, because you've got your learner stats. Do we actually monitor children who do drop out? How do we actually support these children that leave school and find ways in which we need to support them as well? What about schools? Do schools develop a positive environment where the children feel included? It's something that's very important, and something that we seem to be lacking in schools as well and that we need to address is many of our schools that lack resources. The extracurricular activities that children are involved in after school is non-existent. And if you have to look at schools that are functioning well, the children are involved in extracurricular activities after school. So if the child is not succeeding academically and the child is able to join some sport like soccer or netball, you have a sense of achievement, of accomplishment, and you're motivated and you can go right back. And that feeds back into your academics as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach that needs to be taken care of. But I do think that we fail our children when we don't reach out to them to find out what support you need, what are you struggling with, and we lose them in this.
And of course, we will make more time because, as I said, as we move into this new academic year for institutions of higher learning as well, we'll discuss more of these matters because we haven't even touched on the issue of inclusivity as far as children with special needs are concerned. What has happened to them in all of this? But hoping to have that conversation later on in the week. Thank you so much, Professor Sarita Ramsaroop, Head of Department, Childhood Education at the University of Johannesburg, and Kimberley Khumalo, Researcher at Equal Education, talking to us about some of the issues affecting South Africa's basic education system.